The Scottish town wasn't on any tourist map. It was a place of gray stone, green hills, and a weather that changed its mind every hour. Rain wasn't an event. It was a constant, soft presence, like a quiet neighbor who never left. In a terraced house on a street where everyone knew everyone, a girl sat at an old, scuffed upright piano. The piano had seen better days. Its dark wood was faded in patches, and if you played too hard, a faint, wiry buzz would hum from the strings inside, like a trapped bee. But to the girl, it was a universe. Her name was Lavra, and she was 13. At that age, everything feels like a secret: your thoughts, your hopes, the strange new person you're becoming inside. For Lavra, her biggest secret was the music in her head. It wasn't just the notes on the page. When she played, even a simple scale, she could hear other notes weaving around them, like shadows dancing with their owner. She would hear a low, rumbling chord under a bright melody, or a quick, skipping rhythm trying to break out of a slow march. But she never played these things. Not out loud. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Albright, lived 3 streets over in a house that always smelled of furniture polish and boiled cabbage. Mrs. Albright was a pillar of the local music festival committee. She wore tweed skirts that seemed stiff even when she was sitting, and her gray hair was pinned back in a bun, so tight it looked like it pulled the skin of her forehead smooth. She believed in foundations. She believed in the classics. Most of all, she believed in doing things properly. Accuracy before expression. Lavra, she would say, her voice as crisp as the sheet music she handed over. The composers knew what they were doing. Our job is not to add, but to reproduce, cleanly, clearly. Laura's weekly lesson was a 45-minute exercise in holding her breath. She would sit on the very edge of the polished stool in Mrs. Albright's pristine front room, where a metronome tick-tocked with the judgmental regularity of a heartbeat. The piano here was a handsome, reserved instrument that never buzzed. It sounded polite. "You're fingering on the 3rd bar, dear. Lazy. Again." The dynamics are piano, not a suggestion. Play it like a whisper, not a shout. Again. Feel the rhythm in your bones. Don't just count it. Again. Lavra would play, her careful fingers following the dotted lines on the page as if they were a narrow, dangerous path over a cliff. She played simplified Mozart. She played easy sonatinas that felt like training wheels on a bicycle. She played scales until the notes lost all meaning and became just a physical pattern, like climbing a familiar, boring ladder. And she was good at it. She was accurate. She was clear. Mrs. Albright would give a small, tight nod of approval, a gesture that felt like a stone being dropped into a deep well inside Lavra. It was approval. But it was cold, and it sank out of sight without a splash. The storm was in the silence. It was in the walk home, through the drizzle, her school satchel bumping against her hip. It was in the quiet of her own living room after homework, with the dim lamp casting a warm pool of light over the old upright's keys. Here alone, with the faint smell of yesterday's dinner in the air and the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock, Laura would let her secret out. She would start with Mrs. Albright's piece, the simple, careful tune. But then her shoulders, which had been hunched with concentration, would relax. A little spark would light in her eyes, a spark no one ever saw. Her left hand would drop, finding a rich, low chord that wasn't written down. Her right hand would add a flickering, dancing note above the melody. She'd take the stiff, polite rhythm and swing it, making it bounce and sway. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was having a conversation with them. She'd ask a question with a strange harmony, and answer it with a run of notes that tumbled like pebbles down a hill. Sometimes she'd abandon the sheet music altogether. She'd close her eyes and let her fingers find their own way, making up sad, rainy day tunes that sounded like the view from her window, or quick, excited patterns that felt like the rush of escaping the school gates. The old piano's buzz would join in on the loud parts, a raspy, willing partner in crime. This was her real practice. This was where she felt the music, not in her bones as Mrs. Albright commanded, but in her blood. It was a warm, fizzing feeling that started in her chest and flowed right out to her fingertips, but it was a guilty pleasure. If her mother passed through the room and paused, listening, Laura's hands would instantly snap back to the proper, printed notes, the safe ones. The magic would vanish, replaced by the dutiful plink-plonk of obedience. That sounded nice. Love, her mom would say, putting a hand on her shoulder. Very lively. Laura would just shrug, a blush creeping up her neck. Lively wasn't the goal. Accuracy was. Expression was for later, for when you had mastered the rules. That's what Mrs. Albright said. So the secret music stayed a secret, a world of color and storm locked inside a girl who was learning, very well, how to be gray and quiet. The piano in the polished room was a taskmaster. The piano in her living room was her only true friend. And between the two, Laura felt stretched thin, a quiet girl with a thunderous heart, waiting for a key to turn in a lock she couldn't even see. The rain tapped its usual soft rhythm against the window of Mrs. Albright's front room. Laura sat, back straight, on the polished piano stool, her hands folded in her lap. She had just finished a careful run-through of a Clementi sonatina, her fingers doing exactly what they were told. The metronome on top of the piano was silent for once, but its ticking still seemed to echo in the quiet dot. Mrs. Albright closed the music book with a soft, decisive thud. She looked at Laura over the top of her glasses. There was a long pause, filled only by the distant sound of a car swishing through wet streets outside. The Regional Young Musicians Festival is in 5 weeks, Mrs. Albright said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Laura's stomach did a slow, cold turn. She knew about the festival. Everyone did. It was held every year in the city hall, over in the neighboring, bigger town. It was where all the local music teachers brought their best students to be picked apart by important-looking adjudicators from the city. Laura had heard stories from older kids at school. They talked about freezing up, about forgetting their pieces halfway through, about the stern, unsmiling face of the judge who would scribble notes that decided your fate. The very thought of it made her palms go clammy. I have entered you, Mrs. Albright continued, as if she were announcing they needed more milk. Laura's mouth felt dry. Me? She squeaked. You have good technique. You are reliable. You don't get flustered. Mrs. Albright said this not as high praise, but as a statement of fact, like listing the features of a dependable appliance. For a first-timer, reliability is more valuable than flash. She stood up and went to her tall, wooden music cabinet. She rummaged through a drawer full of sheet music, the papers rustling like dry leaves. Finally, she pulled out a single, slightly faded page and brought it back to the piano. This, she said, placing it on the stand, is what you will play. Laura looked at it. The title at the top read, in old-fashioned font, Rondo alla Turca, and underneath, in smaller letters, Simplified Arrangement for Beginner Pianists. It was Mozart's Turkish March, or at least a ghost of it. Laura knew the real piece. She'd heard it on a classical radio program once. It was a whirlwind. It was bold, fast, and full of military swagger, with tricky runs and dramatic shifts in volume. It was a piece that announced itself. What she was looking at was a pale imitation. The notes were all there, but they were simple. Where the original had thrilling, cascading passages, this version had a few single notes plodding down the scale. The exciting, rumbling bass chords were replaced by plain, single notes. The dynamic markings, the instructions to play loud or soft, were few and basic. It had been stripped of all its danger and fire, tamed into something safe and educational. It was Mozart for toddlers. A wave of disappointment, so sharp it was almost a physical pain, washed through Lavra. She felt her secret inner music, that storm of color and sound, shrivel up and retreat into a dark corner. This was to be her moment on a stage? This nursery rhyme? Mrs. Albright seemed to read the slump in her shoulders. She placed a firm hand on Laura's back, making her straighten up instantly. This is not about showing off, Lavra. This is about experience. Your first festival is about walking onto a stage, managing your nerves, playing what is in front of you clearly, and walking off. Nothing more. Think of it as a musical inoculation, a small, controlled dose of pressure. She pointed a bony finger at the sheet music. Your task is to play these notes correctly. Keep a steady tempo from beginning to end. Observe the few dynamic markings that are there. That is all the adjudicator will look for at this. Level, competence, control. The words felt like a lid being screwed down on a jar. Control, competence. They were the opposite of everything she felt when she was alone with the old upright at home. That was about feeling, about exploration, about a joy that was messy and unpredictable. This was about following a recipe. I want you to learn this by heart, Mrs. Albright instructed. Next week, you will play it for me from memory. We will drill it until you could play it in your sleep. There will be no surprises. That is how you conquer nerves. For the rest of the lesson, they worked on the first few lines. Laura's fingers moved over the keys, producing the simple plodding tune. Each note felt like a betrayal of the composer. Mozart would hate this, she thought miserably as she played a particularly clunky phrase. He'd be embarrassed. Good, Mrs. Albright said, a rare word of approval. See? Clear. Precise. That is the goal. The walk home felt longer than usual. The rain had softened to a mist, coating her hair and jacket in tiny droplets. The sheet music, folded in her satchel, felt like it weighed a ton. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she took a detour through the small, damp park, its benches empty and slick with moisture. She sat on a swing, its chains cold and wet under her hands, and let the disappointment settle. She had secretly, foolishly, hoped that if she ever did something like the festival, it would be with a piece that had a bit of soul, something that had a story to tell. Not this stripped-down, skeletal version of something great. When she finally got home, the house was quiet. Her mum was at work. Lavra dropped her bag in the hallway and went straight to the living room. She didn't turn on the main light, just the small lamp by the piano. The old upright waited for her. Friendly and familiar in the gloom dot, she opened her satchel and took out the offending sheet music. She placed it on the stand with a sense of duty. She played the simplified arrangement from start to finish. It took about a minute. It was boring. It was empty. It ended with a simple, childish chord that just stopped. No flair, no finish. Her hands dropped into her lap. She stared at the black and white keys, at the faint reflection of her own face in the polished wood above them. She looked so small. Then, almost without thinking, her right hand reached out and played the first few notes of the real Turkish march, not the plodding beginner version, but the one from the radio, the one she had secretly hunted down online and learned by ear over months, just for fun. Her fingers flew over a quick, glittering run, her left hand landing on a bold, low chord that made the piano's frame resonate. She played a few bars of the true music, just for herself. It was like stretching a cramped muzzle. It was like taking a deep breath after being in a stuffy room. The difference was staggering. One was a drawing made with a blunt pencil. The other was a painting in full, vibrant color. She stopped abruptly, the last note hanging in the silent room. She looked at the simple sheet music, then at her own hands. A strange new feeling began to push aside the disappointment. It wasn't excitement, not yet. It was more like a prickling sense of rebellion. A quiet, solid no that formed deep in her gut. Mrs. Albright wanted a controlled dose. A simple tune. An experience about managing nerves. But as Lavra sat in the quiet, darkening room, the real music still humming in her ears, she knew something else. She knew she couldn't just play the simple tune. To walk onto a stage and offer that. It would be a lie. It wouldn't be her. It would be a version of her that had been simplified and stripped down, just like the Mozart. The weight was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't just the weight of expectation anymore. It was the weight of a choice. She folded the simple sheet music and put it back in her bag. She would learn it. She would be able to play it in her sleep, just as Mrs. Albright demanded. But as she closed the piano lid, the real music continued to play on a loop in her mind. Faster, brighter, and louder than anything on that faded page. A plan, fragile and terrifying, was beginning to take shape in the shadows of her thoughts. The week that followed was a strange kind of double life. Lavra felt like she was living in two different worlds, and she had to keep a wall between them. In the bright, polished world of Mrs. Albright's front room, she was the model student. She practiced the simplified Turkish march until it was perfect. She could play it with her eyes closed, her hands moving automatically over the keys in the safe, plodding rhythm. She worked on making it clean, precise, and utterly uninteresting. Good, Mrs. Albright would say, nodding as the final, simple chord faded. Steady tempo. Accurate notes. That is exactly what they want to hear. No drama. Just solid playing. Laura would nod back, her face a mask of quiet obedience. Inside, though, a different rehearsal was happening. In the dim, familiar world of her own living room, late at night or early in the morning when the house was still, she practiced the real thing. She didn't need sheet music for it. She had learned it by ear, by feel. It was in her fingers and in her bones. This practice wasn't about getting the notes right. She already had them. It was about letting the music take over. It was about building the speed so the run sounded like a shower of silver coins. It was about making the contrasts between loud and soft so dramatic they made your heart jump. She practiced the feeling of it, the swagger, the joy, the sheer cheekiness of the piece, but she always started these secret sessions the same way. She would place the beginner's sheet music on the stand. She would play the simple, slow version perfectly, just as Mrs. Albright demanded. Then, at the exact point where the simple arrangement looped back to repeat, she would shift. Her shoulders would drop, her back would straighten, and her fingers would leap into the true, complex melody. It was like watching a cartoon character suddenly transform into a real person. The change was instant and total. The hard part was the transition. Making it smooth. Making it feel like it was always meant to happen. She practiced that moment over and over the last bland note of the simple tune. A tiny, almost invisible breath, and then the explosion of the real music. It had to sound intentional, not like a mistake. It had to sound like a revelation, not a rebellion. The guilt was a constant, knowing companion. She was lying. To Mrs. Albright, who was spending her time preparing her. To her mother, who was so proud she was going to the festival. Every time she nodded and promised to stick to the simple piece, she felt the lie settle heavier in her stomach. But the thought of actually going through with it, of walking onto a stage and playing only the simple version, felt like a worse kind of dishonesty. It felt like lying to herself. It felt like showing the world a faded photograph when she had a living, breathing person inside her. One afternoon, about a week before the festival, she was in her room. Her school books open but ignored on her desk. She could hear her mum moving around in the kitchen downstairs, the clatter of pots, a comforting, normal sound. Her mom appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a tea towel. "How's the famous piano piece coming along?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe with a warm smile. "It's fine," Lavra said, too quickly. She looked down at her maths homework. Her mom stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Just fine? You've been practicing non-stop. It must be more than fine." Lavra shrugged, her throat tight. She wanted to tell her. She wanted to blurt out the whole plan, the secret rehearsals, the terrifying switch. But the words stuck. Her mom would worry. She'd tell her to listen to her teacher, that Mrs. Albright knew best. She'd tell her not to make a fuss or take a risk. "It's just a very simple piece," Lara managed to say, picking at a thread on her duvet. "It's not very—" Her mom was quiet for a moment. Then she said, softly, "What's the U piece sound like then?" Laura looked up surprised. Her mom's face was kind, curious. It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question. Without a word, Lavra got up and walked to the living room. Her mom followed. Lavra sat at the old piano. She didn't play the simple tune first. She just took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and played a section from the middle of the real Turkish march. It was a fast, joyful part, full of energy and life. She didn't play at all, just 20 seconds or so. The notes filled the small room, bouncing off the walls, vibrant and alive. When she finished, the silence felt different, thicker. She turned to look at her mom. Her mom's eyes were a little wide. She let out a slow breath. "Oh, Laura," she whispered, That's not simple at all. That's beautiful. It's like a different person playing." "That's the real piece," Laura said, her voice small. "What Mrs. Albright gave me is like a skeleton of it. She says the festival is about control, not expression." Her mum came over and put a hand on her shoulder. She looked at the piano, then back at her daughter's worried face. "Your teacher's a smart woman. She knows about these competitions." Laura's heart sank. "But," her mum continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, "she doesn't know what I just heard. She doesn't sit in this room." She squeezed Laura's shoulder. "I can't tell you what to do up on that stage. That's between you and the piano. All I'll say is this. You've got to be able to live with the song you play when you walk off it. However it goes." It wasn't permission. It wasn't a plan. But it was a tiny crack in the wall of expectation. It was someone acknowledging the other world, the secret one. Lavra felt a surge of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. The day before the festival, she had her final lesson with Mrs. Albright. Laura played the simple arrangement flawlessly, 3 times in a row. "Excellent," Mrs. Albright said, genuinely pleased. "You have mastered it. Remember tomorrow. Walk calmly. Bow. Adjust the stool if you need to. Take a moment to picture the first notes. Then play exactly as you have here. No faster, no slower. Walk off with your head held high. You have done the work. Now just execute." That night, Laura couldn't sleep. The 2 pieces of music chased each other around her head, the dull, safe one and the wild, real one. She thought about Mrs. Albright's trust. She thought about her mom's quiet words. She thought about the weight of the secret and the heavier weight of disappointing herself. She got out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. In the moonlight coming through the window, the piano keys looked like bone. She didn't play. She just sat there, her hands in her lap, staring at the instrument. This was it. The choice was no longer a future idea. It was here, now, in the quiet of the night. She could follow the plan, the safe path. She could be the good, obedient student and give them exactly what they asked for. or she could give them what she had. She thought about the feeling she got when the music switched, that jolt of electricity that ran up her spine. She thought about the bored, polite applause the simple piece would get. Then she thought about the risk. The judges might stop her. They might disqualify her. Mrs. Albright would be furious, humiliated. It could all end in disaster, a memory of shame to carry forever. But as she sat in the silent dark, the real music seemed to swell inside her, louder than all the fearful thoughts. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about being better than anyone. It was about truth. It was about finally, for 1 minute on a stage, letting the secret world out into the open and seeing if it could breathe. Just before dawn, she made her decision. It settled in her stomach, cold and solid, like a stone. She was terrified. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't pulled in two directions anymore. The path, however scary, was clear. She went back to bed and slept for 1 hour, a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the stone of decision was still there. It was heavy, but it was hers. The city hall felt like a different planet. It was so much bigger than anything in their small town. The ceiling was high and vaulted, lost in shadow. Heavy red curtains framed the stage, and the lights shining down on the grand piano made it look like a glossy, black animal, sleeping and dangerous. The hall was a sea of noise. Children in stiff shirts and pretty dresses scurried everywhere, their faces pale with nerves. Parents whispered urgently, straightening collars and smoothing hair. The air smelled of floor polish and old wood and the damp wool of good coats. From backstage, Lavra could hear the other performers. A violin squeaked through a difficult passage, then stopped and started again. A flute played a watery, trembling scale. Each sound was a little knife of anxiety. She sat on a hard plastic chair in a corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. She was wearing her one good dress, which suddenly felt too tight under the arms. Her sheet music for the simple piece was folded in her pocket, the paper damp from her sweaty palms. She didn't need to look at it. Every boring note was etched into her mind. Mrs. Albright appeared beside her, a pillar of tweed in the chaos. "Deep breaths," she said, her own voice a bit tight. "Number 14. You're on after the boy with the cello. Remember, walk, bow, play. It is a process. Just follow the process." Lavra nodded, unable to speak. Her throat had closed up. The stone of her decision, which had felt so solid in her bedroom, now felt like it was cracking apart inside her. What was she thinking? This was a hall full of serious people, of rules. They had a schedule. They had adjudication forms. They didn't want surprises. The cellist before her finished. There was a polite patter of applause that sounded thin and hollow in the big space. A lady with a clipboard leaned around the curtain. "Number 14, please, Lavra." Her legs felt like they were made of water. Somehow she stood up. Mrs. Albright gave her a firm nod. Her mum, sitting in the third row, caught her eye and gave a small, encouraging smile that didn't hide her own worry. The walk to the piano was the longest of her life. Her shoes clicked on the wooden stage, the sound huge in the sudden quiet. The lights were blindingly hot, making the rest of the hall fade into a dark, murmuring blur. She could just make out the adjudicator at a little table to the side, a serious-looking man with a neat beard. His pen poised over a stack of papers. She reached the piano. She gave a stiff, quick bow, as she'd been taught. The sound of her own movement rustled in the silence. She adjusted the shiny piano stool, the metal cold under her fingers. She sat down. The keys stretched out before her, a landscape of black and white. For a terrifying second, her mind went utterly blank. She couldn't remember a single note, simple or complex. She couldn't remember her own name. The silence in the hall grew heavier, waiting. Then, like a machine switching on, her training took over. Her hands floated to the right starting position. She took the breath Mrs. Albright had told her to take. And she began. A simple tune emerged, clean and precise. It was exactly as she had practiced it 1,000 times. The notes were clear little pebbles, dropped one after another into a still pond. It was competent. It was utterly controlled. She saw the adjudicator's head nod, just once, as his pen began to move. He was making a note. Good start. Accurate. He'd heard this 100 times before today. He was already moving on in his mind. Laura played through the first section, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment was rushing at her. The piece was designed to repeat. She reached the end of the line, the place where the simple arrangement said to go back to the beginning and play it all again. Her fingers played the last simple note. It hung in the air. Plain and unremarkable. Time seemed to stretch, to bend. In that sliver of a second, she saw everything. Mrs. Albright's stern, trusting face. Her mum's anxious eyes. The adjudicator's waiting pen. The terrifying dark space of the hall. And she saw the old upright at home with its friendly buzz. She felt the storm of color in her chest, the secret that was about to shrivel and die if she didn't set it free. She took another breath. But this one was different. It wasn't the careful breath of control. It was a deep, gathering breath, like a diver about to plunge. Her posture changed. It wasn't a big movement, but everyone felt it. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up near her ears, dropped and settled. Her back straightened, not with stiffness, but with a new kind of authority. Her head lifted just a fraction. Then her hands moved. The next note wasn't the simple, repeating one. It was a low, powerful chord that rang out like a drumbeat in the quiet hall. It was a sound that had weight, that had purpose. The adjudicator's pen stopped moving. Before anyone could even process the change, Laura's right hand flew into motion. What had been a plodding, single-note melody exploded into a whirlwind of notes, a cascade of sound that was brilliant and fast and full of fire. It was no longer a child's tune. It was Mozart's Turkish march in all its wild military glory. A shockwave went through the room. It was a physical thing. Parents who had been gazing drowsily at their programs sat bolt upright. The other children backstage, who had been fidgeting, went perfectly still. The adjudicator slowly lowered his pen onto the table, his eyes fixed on the girl at the piano. Laura didn't see any of it. The moment the real music left her fingers, the fear vanished. She was inside the music now. It was a river, and she was riding it. Her fingers weren't thinking. They were remembering, feeling, flying. The loud sections were bold and brave, her small hands hammering out chords that filled the vast space. The soft, skipping arts were playful and light, a mischievous whisper after the shout. She played as she had alone in her living room, with everything she had. The grand piano was no longer a scary monster. It was her ally, its rich, powerful voice finally being used the way it was meant to be. The music swelled and danced and marched, telling a story of energy and joy and defiance. In the third row, her mum's hands had flown to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock, then filling with tears that weren't sad at all. Backstage, Mrs. Albright stood frozen, one hand gripping the curtain. Her face was unreadable, a storm of surprise, disbelief, and something else that might, just might, have been the beginnings of understanding. The final section approached, a thrilling rush of notes tumbling one over the other, climbing higher and higher. Laura drove into it, her whole body leaning into the music. And then came the last famous chords, bold, declarative, triumphant. Asterisk, bang, dash, bang, dash, bang. Asterisk, the last note slammed into the silence, and reverberated through the hall, vibrating in the wood and in the chests of everyone listening. Then, nothing. Absolute, perfect quiet. Laura's hands fell from the keys into her lap. She was trembling, but it was from the energy still coursing through her. The heat of the lights was intense. She could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. For 3 long seconds, the hall stayed silent. No one clapped. No one moved. They were all suspended in the space she had created, stunned by what had just happened. Then, from the darkness of the audience, one person began to clap. Then another. And another. It wasn't the polite patter from before. It was a wave of sound, loud and warm and real. It grew and grew, filling the hall until it was a roar. People were getting to their feet. Laura, dazed, stood up from the stool. She turned to face the dark, roaring hall. She gave her little bow again, but this time it felt different. This time, it wasn't something she'd been taught to do. It was something she needed to do. A thank you. An acknowledgement. As she straightened up, her eyes found the adjudicator's table. He was standing too. He wasn't clapping. His hands were on the table, and he was just looking at her. His face was serious, but his eyes were bright. He gave her a single, slow nod. It wasn't the nod of someone checking off a box. It was the nod of someone who had just been given a gift. Then she walked off the stage, the sound of the applause washing over her like warm rain, carrying away the last fragments of the stone that had been inside her for so long. The applause followed her off the stage like a living thing, a warm, roaring tide that filled the wings and washed over her. For a moment, she just stood there in the semi-darkness, her ears ringing, her heart still pounding from the final chords. The bright, noisy world backstage seemed muffled and distant. Other students stared at her with wide, awestruck eyes. The cellist who had played before her gave her a shaky thumbs up. Then she saw her teacher. Mrs. Albright was standing perfectly still, a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The older woman's face was pale, her usual composure shattered. She looked like someone who had just witnessed an earthquake. She didn't look angry. She looked lost. Laura's own brief moment of triumph froze solid. The reality of what she had done came crashing down. She had disobeyed. She had humiliated her teacher in front of the entire festival. She braced herself for the storm. Mrs. Albright took a step forward. Her mouth opened, then closed. No words came out. Instead, she just looked at Laura, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the very first time. After what felt like an eternity, she simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of backstage helpers without a sound. It was worse than shouting. The disappointment was a cold, heavy blanket. The rest of the festival passed in a blur for Laura. She sat with her mom in the audience, but she didn't hear the other performers. The soaring flute, the careful sonatas, all of it was just noise. She replayed Mrs. Albright's silent exit over and over in her mind. Her mom held her hand tightly, but even that comfort couldn't reach the chill inside her. She had chosen her truth, and now she had to live with the consequences. She felt utterly alone. Finally, the last performer finished. The head of the festival committee, a woman with a kind face and a loud voice, took the stage. "We will now hear the adjudications and present the awards," she announced. Lavra sank lower in her seat. This was the part where they would talk about rule following and respecting the set pieces. They would probably mention her as a cautionary tale. She just wanted to go home. The adjudicator, the serious man with the beard, walked to the podium. He shuffled his papers and adjusted the microphone. He began to speak about each performer, starting with the very youngest. His voice was calm, measured, and insightful. He pointed out good technique here, a lovely tone there, and offered gentle suggestions for improvement. He gave out the third-place ribbon, then the second. The winners smiled. Their parents beamed. Laura didn't hear her name called for any of them. Of course not. She had broken the rules. She was probably disqualified. She stared at her lap, waiting for it all to be over. And finally, the adjudicator said, his voice changing slightly. It grew quieter, more personal. There is one performance I need to speak about separately. It does not fit neatly into our categories. The hall grew still. Laura's mum squeezed her hand so hard it almost hurt. We come to these festivals to assess skill, he continued, looking out at the audience. We look for accuracy, for memory, for control. These are the bricks and mortar of music, and they are vital. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But very, very rarely, we are reminded of what those bricks and mortar are meant to build. We are reminded of the spirit that the music exists to serve. He looked down at his notes, then directly towards where Lavra was sitting. She felt every pair of eyes in the hall turn to her. I listened to a young pianist today play a simplified arrangement of a Mozart rondo, he said. She played it perfectly, exactly as written. It was competent. It was tidy. He paused again, and a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. And then she decided to show us something else. She decided to play Mozart, not as a set of instructions, but as a living, breathing conversation. Laura's breath caught in her throat. What we witnessed, he said, his voice growing stronger, filling the hall, was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of revelation. She revealed the magnificent architecture inside the simple blueprint. She reminded every single one of us in this room, teachers, parents, fellow students, why we bother to learn the notes in the first place. It is not for the notes themselves. It is for the joy, the fire, and the soul they can contain. He picked up a single special certificate from the table. It was different from the ribbons. The rules are important. They give us a framework. But there is a quality that exists beyond the framework. It is called artistic courage. It is the courage to share what you truly hear, what you truly feel in the music. He held up the certificate. It is my great privilege, as adjudicator, to award a special judge's discretionary award. This is not for first place. This is for something rarer. This is for reminding us of the heart of music itself. Would Lara please come to the stage? The applause started again, warmer and more respectful than before. It wasn't the shocked roar from right after her performance. It was a deeper, understanding kind of clapping. Her mum had to gently nudge her to stand up. Her legs carried her to the stage on autopilot. Walking up there felt completely different. The lights weren't blinding anymore. They were just bright. The faces in the audience weren't a scary blur. They were smiling. She reached the adjudicator. He shook her hand firmly and placed the certificate in her other hand. He leaned in slightly so only she could hear. Never lose that, he said quietly, his eyes serious and kind. The technique will come. The control will come. What you have is a gift. Don't ever let anyone simplify it again. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were tears of relief, of a weight being lifted she hadn't even known she was carrying. She managed a wobbly bow and walked off the stage, the certificate crisp in her hand. Back in the milling crowd of the hall, people patted her shoulder and smiled. She saw her mum talking to Mrs. Albright near the doors. Her heart sank again. She made her way over, the certificate feeling suddenly flimsy. Her mum saw her and stepped aside. Lavra was left facing her teacher. Mrs. Albright's face was still pale, but the lost look was gone. In its place was something weary and thoughtful and deeply human. Well, Mrs. Albright said, her voice a little hoarse. That was certainly not what we rehearsed. I'm sorry, Lavra whispered, the words finally breaking free. I'm so sorry I didn't do what you said. Mrs. Albright was silent for a long moment. She looked at the certificate in Laura's hand, then back at her student's face. "He was right, you know," she said finally, nodding towards the adjudicator across the room. "The man with the beard. About the bricks and mortar." She sighed, a sound that seemed to come from a long way off. "I have spent 40 years teaching children how to lay bricks, how to mix the mortar. It is important work. Without it, the building collapses." She reached out and, to Laura's astonishment, put a hand on her arm. It wasn't a firm, correcting grip. It was just a touch. "I forgot," Mrs. Albright said, her voice so low Laura almost didn't hear it, "to tell some of you what you were building. I forgot to tell you to look up and see the sky through the windows." She gave Laura's arm a gentle squeeze and let go. "Don't lose the bricks. You'll need them. But for heaven's sake, don't you ever lose those windows either." She turned and walked out of the hall, her tweed coat disappearing into the gray afternoon light. She didn't say goodbye, and she didn't say anything about future lessons. But she had said everything. On the bus ride home, the rain was back, streaking the windows. Laura leaned her head against the cool glass, the certificate safe in her bag. She felt exhausted, emptied out, but clean. The storm inside her was quiet now, not because it was locked away, but because it had finally rained itself out. "What are you thinking?" her mum asked softly. Laura watched the wet fields roll by. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I need a new piece to learn. Not a simple one, not a show-off one, just a real one. Something with bricks and mortar and great big windows." Her mum smiled and put an arm around her, pulling her close. The bus engine hummed, the wipers swished, and for the first time in a long time, the quiet felt peaceful, full of possibility instead of secrets. The performance was over, but the music, her own true music, had only just begun.